criteria to determine a pre-existing lot. The Windward and Leeward Planning Commissions forward their favorable recommendations for this amendment to the the subdivision code, which would add a criterion for determining a pre-existing lot. Reference Communication 656, introduced by Ms. Eoff by request.
We got the motion by Ms. Leloy, second by Ms. David. I'd like to ask, I see the planning director and the deputy planning director here in the chambers. Thank you for coming forward.
Michael Yee, planning director. Without too much technicality, just want to clarify that there was a practice that people could go in to the Board of Conveyances and basically present information, parcel and stuff, without going through subdivision of the planning department, and would get assigned TMK numbers and stuff, and then would be able to get taxed. Except if it wasn't, if we didn't have record of it, and we were then asked to determine pre-existing lot, we may see something on a map, but it had not gone through subdivision. So planning department didn't recognize it. So it was starting to, or it caused an issue with clear title sometimes when people asked, is this a lot? People buy and sell property all the time, and without being able to say, yes, this was a pre-existing lot that was approved by the county via the planning department, it would just raise questions. So we reached the point here where we felt like it was time to just clarify it, add this criteria in, so all these innocent folks could be, have clear title and just clear recognition of having a pre-existing lot. And again, this practice went all the way up until 1999 when we took over the subdivision, and then assigning, or not taking over subdivision, but assigning the tax map keys. So that's the short of it.
So I'm just going to open it up to the council
Yeah, and
members
if we
have any.
excuse me, if we need more technical data, I brought the team that would really have the technical information, in the deputy and Jonathan Holmes.
Just recently, I ran into a muddle trying to help out one of the subdivisions in my district. This is Hawaiian Shores Beaches. There is only one TMK assigned to all the roads in 2 separate subdivisions. So Hawaiian Shores Recreational Estates, the only one with a community association, homeowners association, was in the process, or is still in the process of trying to procure a USDA rural development loan to resurface their 11.5 miles of privately held roads. They've never been separated out from that section that the county owns, which was under a separate subdivision, Hawaiian Shores Estates, without the recreation in it, just to confuse everybody. So I met with your map person, Mary, and the real property tax office, and Trevor from, is it Trevor? From Trevor Jackson from the Department of Public Works. And what we can determine from the paperwork that's held within the county is that we have a designation that separates within a single TMK, but it was never made into 2 separate TMKs. And I'm wondering now if that's something that planning can undertake, because it would certainly make life a whole lot easier, since we hold the warranty deeds in DPW that designate exactly at what lot the road changes ownership, but it still sits in a single TMK, and it's been very problematic for this whole federal grant process. Just let you know, like, some of the nasty things that came out of the old subdivision process. So I'm wondering how this wording would affect that situation, and if we could then move to 2 separate TMKs for those road parcels.
We would certainly try to help out as much as we can, and bring it back to the planning department, and we'll have other folks look at it.
Well, I know in that process I was told that the Hawaiian Shores Recreational Estates, the Homeowners Association, holds 4 lots that are contiguous, on which is the Community Association building, as well as our water yard, because we have well-based water system with distributed water amongst the subdivision. And yet, in their research, going back to the late 60s, early 70s, they discovered that in that subdivision process, those 4 lots were actually consolidated, but they had never been consolidated into a single TMK. So they did they are initiating that action to make it into a single TMK. So on the same note, it would seem they could do with the roads, but since the documentation does exist within the county, and it would certainly clear things up because, they weren't able to get title guarantee to give title because of this.
The planning department certainly wants to help clarify things where we can.
Ms. Leloy. Yes. Ms. Leloy.
Thank you, Director. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So I'm going to actually kind of drill down on more of an application part of how this new language helps. So pre-existing lots of record, so PLORs, up until 1999, they were handled by Bureau of Conveyances. I see Darren nodding. Darren? Come on.
Come on up there. Help me out.
Hi, good morning and Happy New Year. Darren Arai, Deputy Planning Director. Prior to 1999, the management and planning of tax maps were handled out of Oahu through the tax map branch of DLNR. We took over control in 1999, which explains why in the proposed amendment, the cutoff date is 1999. Prior to that, our existing code basically says that if a lot existed and you could demonstrate it by a recorded instrument that there was a lot of record that existed prior to 1944, that was the benchmark we used previously. And 1944 basically is when we had the first instances of the subdivision code that guided the subdivision of land within the county of Hawaii. So what we're simply trying to do is cover the gap between 1944 and 1999, where another agency had control over mapping and created a lot of confusion because tax maps were actually designed for taxing purposes. It wasn't created to define legal lots of record, but people now view it as such. So ever since 1999, what we do is before we plat a lot, we make sure that it is supported by an actual subdivision application, subdivision action that was approved by the county. So we reconcile the two instruments.
There's a number of parcels that we have on this island that are recorded with Bureau of Conveyances, but we also have land court, which a lot of properties in Puna are covered by, and maybe even Ka'u, I think so. So how does this language address the lots of record with land court and closing the gap that if there was additional lots of record under land court, that they're being recorded and given the appropriate tax map number to be appropriately taxed? Did I ask that correctly?
You asked it well. It's just a difficult question. Land court, from my understanding, is primarily to ensure clear title. The County of Hawaii, under Chapter 46 Hawaii Revised Statute, has the authority to subdivide land. And so that authority rests solely with us. However, while we have that authority, on land court lands, it must also be cleared of title by the state surveyor, right? So once title is cleared, then we go ahead and assign tax map key numbers. So there are times when we do a subdivision of land, land court lands, but we have to wait until the state surveyor clears title. And then once that is done, then we assign the tax map key numbers, because as you can imagine in the subdivision of land, you may have a land of one owner or multiple owners, but once it's chopped up into little pieces, before a tax map key number is assigned, real property also needs to then assign title to the respective owners. Because from one owner into multiple owners, it needs to define what piece of land goes to which person, which is why we have to wait for clear title.
I just know a lot of people who go through this process and the application part. So when we do with land court, we submit the Mylar first to land court, let that clear, and then submit the subdivision map. And I'm sorry, I know this is kind of really drilling down. It's just that I know a lot of people who are going to have to go through the application process. So I just want to understand it very clearly.
And don't worry, I don't have consultation fees, so you can ask. I mean, because we control subdivision, we need to go through the subdivision process, regardless of whether it's land court or regular system. But once final subdivision is approved, the maps are then filed by the applicant with land court. Land court will go through their process to ensure title and that the boundaries are accurate and so forth and so on. And once land court confirms that, then we assign the tax map key numbers. Keep going.
Pre-existing lots of record, if they go through a parcel consolidation re-subdivision, is that still afforded with this language? So we have 8 lots of record. They're going to consolidate and re-subdivide back into 8 lots, but just a little bit of different configuration, you know, better roadways, wider roadways. Does this language still afford them that opportunity?
It depends. When a subdivision application is submitted to our office, we will check parcel history to ensure that the parcel being subdivided or consolidated and re-subdivided are actual legal lots of record. If we do not find that the lots were created appropriately through the subdivision process, we will then ask the applicant to provide documentation so we can then make a pre-existing lot determination. Because as you may know, that there are provisions in the subdivision code where if you consolidate lots and re-subdivide them into the same number of lots, then the requirements of the subdivision code can be waived or shall be waived. So there's a lot of privileges that goes along with that privilege. So we have to make sure that those lots that existed previously are actual legal lots of record, which is why, yes, this could accommodate them because now only lots that were justified as being in existence prior to 1944 were available for consideration. Now we're basically saying that because of the mapping and because of, I guess, the lack of communication between government entities, that we've now extended to 1999, provided that you can provide proper documentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to yield. I have a few other questions, but I think they're just a lot more technical, and I'll just have a different conversation with the planning director and Mr. Arai. So thank you. I yield at this time.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Liloy. Any other questions? Ms. David?
Yes, thank you. The documentation that you just spoke of, what would that entail that you would be requesting people to provide in order to become a legal lot of record? Is that something they would have to go through an attorney to do, or is it an application that they file? And the reason I'm asking that question while you're looking for the answer is while the land court, while we wait for land court to confirm clear title, what is the process on non-land court lots that we would require confirmation of clear title before we assign a lot? I mean, the only reason I'm asking is this island, as you know, have a lot of undivided interests, and like she said, Kuleana lots. So I'm just wondering what is the safety net on non-land court as opposed to confirming clear title?
If you attach to the communication is the draft bill, And as you can see, the proposed amendment is adding one additional criteria to the criteria that already existed. So the two that previously existed, which is defined by section 23-118A as in Apple of the subdivision code, it talks about things like trying to read it. Basically, if there's like documentation of title, like old maps, I'm trying to remember, there were like old file plans, state maps. When the state, there was a surveyor in Hilo. When that office closed, I think the state then transferred all of those maps to the County of Hawaii, and then we have now archived them. So what we basically try to do is try to look for any instances where there was some sort of partitioning of land and somehow recordation somewhere where some government entity recognized it. The two criteria does explain, like for example, one is that the lots were created prior to December 21, 1966 as an agricultural lot in excess of 20 acres. That's one criteria. Another was it was required to maybe a court order, a partition action. That's another criteria. And, you know, so we do look for these type of opportunities, and a lot of times we may not have, we're not a title agency
Right.
or title, I'm not sure the proper word, but so we do rely on landowners to do the research and provide us with that documentation and whatever it may be, and we'll assess it to determine whether or not there was some recognition by a government entity.
Okay, and then, well, thank you for that. So only lots prior to 1999 is covered by this proposed amendment. So anything
Yes.
after that, we assume that it's all
Through subdivision.
complete,
Yes.
right? Okay, so this, anything before 1999 is what's covered by this amendment.
That's correct.
Okay, all right.
And I'm
Oh.
sorry, and there are two distinctions now, right?
Mhm.
Prior to 1944, or prior to 1944, we look at instruments that was like recorded or somehow documented previously. Up to 1973, you can include partition actions. Up to 1966, you can include agricultural lots in 20 acres. So each time we keep expanding the time frame, but it doesn't mean that those criteria covers all the way up to 1999.
I see.
There are certain, the gap really here is from 1944 basically to 1999, where we're basically saying that in the absence of such documentation, if
At different
a tax
levels.
map was platted and building permits were issued, there was conveyances that occurred, that's a
Then-
separate criteria that covers the gap from 1944 to 1999.
Perfect. All right, mahalo for that. I yield.
The process by which you guys go through previously to this. A homeowner would come in, they want a record or recorded lot, right? But it's not there. But I'm just trying to see, because these are all legally within the state, the Bureau of Conveyances, everything's legal, correct? If it's all recorded and went through the process. So, I mean, is this just kind of clearing up our code and how we process things? Or if we never had this, how would you keep on going through this process?
In essence, we wouldn't. I mean, because the code, as you well know, can be really hard and fast. Like, again, we only had opportunities under originally criteria A and B to consider only certain types of documentation and justification in order to make a pre-existing lot determination. There have been many instances, and I know of one personally, where an elementary school teacher of mine lived on the parcel for decades, only to realize that when she wanted to do her estate planning, she realized that her home sat in a subdivision of 4 lots that was never approved by the county. And I think whoever did the subdivision simply platted it with Bureau with no subdivision approval, and it got platted on the subdivision maps, on the tax maps. But decades later, there was absolutely nothing we could do for her. So in essence, she has undivided interest in a larger piece of land. So there was no way for her to clear the title. And it would mean that she would have to work with all those homeowners and then put in subdivision improvements that we realized she would not be able to satisfy because it was an old layout with substandard roads. So this would help in that particular instance. It's not legal all the way when you really think about it, but by providing this exception, for the lack of a better term, it will then make it legal.
But at the time they were doing this, it was legal, correct? That process.
It was legal in the sense that Bureau of Conveyances allowed you to record any instrument. They are simply, I try not to mischaracterize them, but I view them as like a repository only. They do not check for legality. They simply make sure it's appropriate to form, and you can then record anything. Whatever is recorded at Bureau is then picked up by tax map branch. Back then, tax map branch in Honolulu, and they would simply plot it on the tax maps. And that's where the confusion. It may have been proper to their process, but it wasn't proper to our process. What we're simply doing is recognizing what was done back then and simply saying it is unfair because some government entity basically said it's good, even though it wasn't in adherence to all laws, both local and state level.
I'm assuming you guys have been dealing with this since 1999?
Yes, we've seen quite a few.
Just how come it's taken this long to try to rectify the situation? I'm not blaming anybody, but if there was a problem, you know, after this went through that process, why now is it only coming up?
Different leadership with a different focus on what needs.
Priorities.
Right.
And over the years, you can see where past planning directors have had compassion. You know, they would see the problem and, you know, and honestly, decisions were made because they realized that irrespective of the law, there were actions taken by government.
Mm-hmm.
This simply codifies it now to make it clear to anyone out there they have
It's
this
legal.
opportunity that they can utilize.
Before this, could the planning director or planning department make that determination for what we're trying to do now? Or has it happened?
They could have. I mean, each director operates on, you know, they use their best judgment. And that judgment is based on the evidence that's given to them at that time. This simply defines it really clear. Like, for example, previously, you know, we weren't really sure what date to use, but it became apparent to us that the date we took over control of the tax maps is the best date to use because after 1999 is when we started reconciling between the subdivision actions and the tax maps.
Just one last question. How many subdivisions are we talking about and how many lots? Or approximate. I don't know if you even have a number.
We do not have a number. What we've done is all subdivisions that we have approved since the early 1940s, we have, I believe we plotted every single one in GIS, our Geographic Information System. And there's a way to highlight those maps so it shows which lands are covered by an actual subdivision application. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything else is illegal. It just says that we don't have enough information to determine whether or not it did go to the proper process. Because remember, prior to 1944, if it was recognized by an entity, then we will accept it as a legal lot of record. Not every lot in this county has gone through that analysis.
Really?
Okay. I'll yield.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Kanuha.
And I can appreciate how all government agencies are trying to fit into one another with the Bureau of Conveyances, with Land Court, with our subdivision code. Was there any consultation done with the title companies? And I'm asking that question because that's where a lot of these owners have people research the title or the deed. And having worked in areas where we've actually had to craft the deeds and the different meets and bounds with, the surveyor, has there any consultation been done with the title companies so that what we're doing is really streamlining the process or actually reducing the cost of transferring properties to families?
Part of the ability of title companies to provide accurate information or complete information, I guess is the better term, is really dependent too largely on how complete the records of government is. Because a lot of times title companies will reach out to our office asking if there's any records. They do their own title search to Land Court or Bureau of Conveyances, but that can sometimes only take you that so far as well. So the title companies are aware of our process, but whether we've had any extensive discussions with them on how to make it better, not really, at least not to my knowledge. But we feel that this proposal here is an attempt to provide at least clarity.
Yeah, because I'm going through the process, having done it before. So before, property owners or parties were able to request letters of parcel recognition from the director. Is that still available, or does this clean that up? And not this director, but in the past we used to get like confirmation letters from the director that, there are different parcels that do exist. Will that process still be available, or does this bill clean that up?
Oh, no, this does not change that process. The pre-existing lot determination
Yes.
process has been in place for many, many years.
Right.
I can't even recall how many decades it's been around. This simply enhances the opportunities for the director to consider what can be officially defined as a legal lot of record, or pre-existing lot of record, I should say.
And then we're going to get into action to quiet title, but I'll leave that for you, me, and a few others. So I'm going to yield at this time, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Liloy. Are there any other comments or questions? Then before we vote, I just wanted to thank you for thoroughly explaining this. I looked at it, and I know you were patient with my staff asking a lot of questions, and I think my fellow council members elevated the conversation to a really understandable level now, and so thank you. Okay. All in favor of moving Bill 88 to council with a positive recommendation, please say aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Okay, we have 7 ayes and 2 are excused. Bill 88 will move with a favorable recommendation to council. Okay, thanks again. Okay, may I have a motion to adjourn? Thank you. Motion by Mr. Kanuha, second by Ms. David. All in favor? Aye. Okay, we have 7 ayes. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.